Hey everyone, Phil Plisky here. I am so excited to share with you some research that was recently published by our team from the military that I really think will dramatically impact practice. This team was able to pull off this massive research study that is really hard to do. You see, injury risk, all know that it's multifactorial. It's not just one risk factor. It's not just previous injury, or it's not just balance or movement or mobility or stability. It's not one thing. And I think everybody recognizes that, but I don't think everybody recognizes how hard it is to pull off a multifactorial study. You see, back in 04, 05, when I did the original star excursion balance test study in high school basketball players, that was across 8 different high schools in a couple different counties. In the logistics of that and all the prepping and planning and the testing days, and then following those athletes out for a whole basketball season, dealing with the coaches and the players and getting all that information, literally almost made me quit research because it is just so hard. Because, see, you need a large number of subjects and a long enough follow-up period in order to look at multiple risk factors. I was just looking at one risk factor in balance and it just about killed me. Well, this all started when Doctors Tahan and Schaefer came to the University of Evansville to see Kyle Kiesel for some low back pain research that they were all involved in. And as they were here, they saw that we were testing our athletes, 150 athletes in a couple-hour period, and giving them a risk category. And they said, well, this is something we have to do in the military. This is so important. And so we stepped back and we had this great team of researchers. Please look at the author list, the acknowledgements list, and then there's probably hundreds of others actually that worked on this study. So we can't acknowledge them enough. But this team of researchers came together and said, okay, if we had unlimited ability to look at risk factors for injury, how would we do it? What risk factors would we use? And so we scoured the literature and tried to find out every single risk factor that was potential for injury risk in the military. And when we looked at that, the only criteria we used, though, to kind of decrease the number was it had to be reliable and it had to be field expedient, meaning it had to be able to be easily tested or feasibly tested on a lot of people in a short period of time. So scouring the literature, the research team came up with these risk factors. 86 survey items. So these are things that you can ask the person. Everything from your standard demographics, height, weight, all those kinds of things. Biopsychosocial factors, everything from anxiety, depression, anger, risk-taking behavior, previous injury, time loss. The SANE score, let me pause here for a second. The SANE score, you may or may not be aware of what that is. Basically, it's a question that if you have been injured, how well or are you now? How much return to function have you had? 0 being I have not returned to function at all, 100% being I'm completely normal. That's going to become important later. And then looking at their load, their Army fitness tests were reported. So those were all the historical information that we gathered that had showed potential for identifying those who were at increased risk of injury. Then there were physical tests, and the physical tests included arch height index, ankle dorsiflexion, the functional movement screen, Y balance test, upper and lower quarter, hop testing. We even looked at vertical jump testing and looking at dynamic valgus and trying to grade that in a field expedient way. We weren't able to ever come up with a reliable method to do that, no matter what system we used. We ran the reliability through the Army Baylor PT students and trained them on the tests. And so we were able to determine which tests were reliable and how we needed to tweak them to make them more reliable. But anyway, so we have this huge battery of tests. Now, remember, I said that's really hard to do. You need a large sample size and a long follow-up period in order to look at that many factors. Well, so what we did was we tested well over 1,500, but when you think of dropouts and things like that, we ended up with a sample size of 1,466. A lot of times when you think military research, or at least I used to think, I had the misconception of everybody in the military was frontline soldiers. And that's actually not the case. What really surprised me is that it's actually quite a cross section of people. There are people who are special forces and frontline soldiers, but then there's a wide spectrum beyond that. Cooks, mechanics, all the way to office workers and different support personnel. So when we analyzed this, we looked at 211 special forces. We know they have a unique physical and psychological makeup that we pulled them out in the analysis, and we published another paper on that already, and I'll link into that below. But so we ended up with 922 of combat service, and combat service support soldiers, and these folks were tested on all of these tests. Then we followed them out for an entire year to see who got injured. We triangulated that injury data using both text messaging and email follow-up to the soldiers, their medical records. So we did a hand search of all their medical records. And also we looked at their profile report of injury and time loss. So you can see why this required so many people. It was such a huge undertaking. So we followed them out for a year, and then statistically looked at each individual risk factor with a crude odds ratio, and then put the factors that were significant into a logistic regression. And here are the results, because I think it's important to understand how the study was done, but the results really, I think, can impact what we do with those in our care. So here's what happened. After running the logistic regression, the most robust risk factors came out. Being older, so age greater than 26, being female, having a previous injury, having profile time, a SANE score of less than or equal to 92.5%, and a 2-mile run time of 15.3 minutes or greater. And so those are all actually factors that you can just get with history with questions. Now, there were some physical tests as well. Those are pain with movement was identified as a risk factor. Dorsiflexion asymmetry in a half-kneeling dorsiflexion, a closed-chain dorsiflexion position of greater than 4.5 degrees. Y-balance test lower quarter less than 72% of limb length. Y-balance test upper quarter superior lateral reach of less than 80%. The lower quarter reach was anterior reach, just to be clear on that. And then Y-balance test upper quarter inferior lateral, that cross under reach asymmetry of greater than 7 3/4. So these were the most robust risk factors as identified by the model. And it's good to know these risk factors, and that's important. But I think this, to me, is the key thing in the study, is that the number of risk factors, when you combine the risk factors together, the number of risk factors really help you identify those who are at more risk. Those who had 0 to 2 risk factors really did not have any significant increased risk. So lower number of risk factors, less risk. When we get to 3 or more, that odds ratio starts to go up. And then when you get to 5 or more, it really starts to go up in that 2 to almost 9-fold increase. And with each risk factor that's added, then your identification of those who are at risk is improvement in accuracy goes up way up. So that's a really important part of the study, because what this tells us is that it is multifactorial. We all know that, and that the number of risk factors really matter. So how do we manage this? Well, what we need to think about is there's 2 major times when we're working with people to help them mitigate that risk or decrease their risk of having an injury. One is at the end of rehab. So when someone's discharged from rehabilitation, we want them to have as few risk factors for future injury as possible. Because remember, previous injury and time again comes out as a risk factor. Well, what a great time to address that is with rehabilitation. Secondly, the other time is pre-season, pre-physical screening, pre-work screening. all those times when the person is well, let's look at how many risk factors they have and see what we can do to decrease those. So I hope you can take this information from the study. Look at the links below. I linked to all the studies over this past 10 years that this research team has put out. My kudos and thanks to them. None of this would be possible. I just happen to be a mouthpiece right now for this study. They were actually the leads on this and did such a great job with it. So next time I'm going to talk about the follow-on studies that we've done where we looked at people who were discharged, so the people who finished rehabilitation and then returned to duty, and tested them on all these risk factors again and followed them out for a year to see who got hurt. I'm going to tell you some information that we presented at CSM recently that I think was, again, very enlightening to clinical practice. So I look forward to sharing that with you next week. If you have any questions in the meantime, don't hesitate to email me through the contact information below, and hopefully this can change your practice.